You might say we're a good 10 years into the social media revolution, from the incipient chat rooms to MySpace to now the cultural staple that is TikTok. From the advent of this technology, debates have raged on its educational, administrative, and recreational potential benefits, as well as the emergence of novel threats, ranging from cyberbullying to DDoSing. Suffice it to say, the philosophical divide seems analogous to the essentialized argument on either side of the gun control dialogue. Proponents of the right to bear arms will say, guns don't kill people, people kill people, just as advocates of the unbridled use of technology would assert that both the benefits and harms are merely reflections of our own human capabilities. In an age in which an individual's platform for expression is limited only by his tech savviness, the question that remains to be answered is, how influenced is the influencer? Has our obsession with the advancement of technology blinded us from seeing our own social decay, or are we simply witnessing innate aspects of growth being expressed in unprecedented ways? With the rise of digital communications brought upon recently by the global pandemic, we have achieved greater accessibility and convenience than ever before. Yet, as we are rapidly ushered into the new age, we must question if it is not simply the mediums changing, but we as a people as well. As we rush towards the enticing future, blurring the lines between online and the real world, we must consider, are we losing sight of our own humanity? And if so, what can we do to reclaim it? H.G. Wells was referred to in his time with many titles: a prolific author, a science fiction visionary, and even an active journalist. Greater than any of his occupational accolades, however, was his reputation as a futurist, someone who explores the possible outcomes of the near or distant future. Through his fascination with humanity's next step, Wells epitomized the challenges of the future. It is quite fitting, then, that in 1938, his now world-famous novel, The War of the Worlds, was adapted for radio by the namesake filmmaker Orson Welles, who sought to test the limits of the medium that at the time was beginning to become ubiquitous. On Halloween night, the adaptation aired live on the Columbian radio network, with a single disclaimer stating that it was part of a modified adaptation. About 20 minutes into the segment, the typical news and weather reports were abruptly interrupted by a series of news bulletins that warned the public of an oncoming Martian invasion. Dazed newscasters described an apocalyptic scene descending onto New York City. Many Americans who had tuned into the segment midway through mistook this work of fiction as a legitimate indication of extraterrestrial forces storming the country. The mass hysteria that ensued is disputed as being a historical embellishment, with some claiming that several listeners committed suicide out of frenzy, and others claiming the public response was more measured. Nevertheless, it is well documented that conversations and newspapers around the country were dominated by outrage at the subversive and deceptive experimental media. A public outcry to regulate such programs emerged, and Orson Welles earned his status as a renowned dramatist. Now, although not all of us may be able to relate to such an experience with radio, I think we can all understand the feeling of alarmed bewilderment after seeing a fake news headline on Instagram, or perhaps being forwarded a provocative article of questionable origin by a family member or friend. The internal dialogue of, no, that can't be true, that we have no doubt all experienced in some capacity, is just as applicable to our lives as it was to those of Orson Welles's in the 20th century. The way that the media performed damage control following the incident seems to be very reminiscent of how our news channels synthesize the latest presidential debates or explain the latest stock market fiasco. And the way that Orson Welles himself profited off the exposure and criticism following that day seems to be a precursor to the contemporary notion that any publicity is good publicity. Of course, the exact details and the methods of expression may differ, but the parallels are plain to see. And so I ask you, my fellow denizens of this sci-fi reality, are the concerns surrounding our usage of technology really that new? Perhaps we have been too disoriented by the wonders of the past decades to realize that we are simply witnessing the natural progression of the human species. And yet, if this is to be believed, and we are to quell our misgivings with today's technology by attributing them to growing pains, then I ask you, why has the rate of young people experiencing symptoms consistent with depression increased to nearly 52% in the past decade, according to the American Psychological Association? The rate of youngsters experiencing suicidal thoughts increased 47% in the same time span, according to the same organization. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention found that between 2007 and 2018, the rate of adolescents aged 10 to 24 experiencing suicide increased almost 60%. If social media has empowered us, bringing us together through instantaneous communication, then why are young people more lonely than ever? About 40% of high schoolers feel lonely, based on the research of San Diego State. The list goes on. These statistics are all taken from the same demographics that have experienced the largest spike in social media usage in the past decade. And while Wells may have foreshadowed the difficulties that awaited us, he could not have predicted just how dire of a crisis could rapidly escalate. Clearly, we have changed dramatically in the past decade alone, and from what we're seeing, it isn't for the better. As the conversation surrounding social media and our frailties continues to evolve, we begin to see that it is difficult to find a single root cause. From misinformation to beauty standards, the internet poses its fair share of issues. However, there is one constant amongst all of the research. Our relationships, and indeed our personalities, do not feel authentic. And this is a statistical reality that for many of us reflects the anecdotal one. How many of us have seen performative activism abound online, demonstrating a superficial commitment to social change? How many of us have perceived a pressure to emulate the artificial lifestyles we see portrayed online? How many of us have seen individuals whom we know lose themselves in echo chambers online where their worldviews, however distorted, are reinforced? And the worst part about it all, there is no easy way out. Early on into the pandemic, I had resolved to unplug. By all accounts, based on our research, that is the right thing to do. Within 3 days, I found myself reinstalling all of my apps. Even if we somehow can overcome these passive addictions, it is undeniable that we are headed into an increasingly technologically dependent time. This means that we must change with the times or be changed by the times, and from what it seems, the latter is not working in our favor. But as I said, this is an issue that encompasses so many others, all stemming from a lack of genuineness. And so we find ourselves at the ultimate question. How do we humanize ourselves and correct this discrepancy between online and the real world? The answer doesn't lie with me, but with people like the dedicated staff and students at my high school who have worked tirelessly over the past year to migrate onto the virtual platform. Or the artists who have taken to social media to share messages of hope and inspiration in trying times. Or even the healthcare workers who have adopted digital communications as one of their essential tools for serving their patients. These are all people who have worked to foster an enduring sense of community, even as we have collectively grown further apart and more divided. Of course, it would have been all too easy for these same people to allow the vast wealth of resources to sweep them into a sedentary lifestyle. If I may use a teleological diversion to neuroscience, our bodies, from the sensory receptors in our skin to the rods and cones in our retina, are all stimulated by contrast and repeated change. The neural mechanisms by which we interface with the world stagnate into silence if the stimulus remains unchanged. Indeed, we can be immersed in a given stimulus, but in the absence of movement, a gradient, or ongoing change, our senses are dulled. It takes a willful effort to tread water, and even more so to swim. And feeling the current of the water beneath us is integral to being able to propel ourselves forward. If we do not make that effort, we may share the fate of that infamous frog in the notorious high school experiment, boiled alive in our own static sensory overload. To avoid this, we must look to those around us, coupling a social need with the application of our intellect. It is the disconnect between the two that has precipitated this era of social media brain candy. Our words and images must ultimately be combined with deeds of goodness, and in doing so, we impart the authenticity of a handshake into our virtual interactions. This allows us to remain anchored during our excursions into technology with a sense of gratification, one that supersedes the endorphin rush we have become accustomed to while tallying our likes. Thank you.